Eloan hadn't planned on running today, but here she was, shoving through a crowd of strangers with her heart in her throat, and one of her sons missing. The harvest market in Dunhalla was supposed to be safe. A backwater trading post on the kingdom's forgotten edge, too insignificant for anyone important to visit, too far from the capital for anyone to notice a woman buying salted fish and wool thread with two small boys tucked close to her sides. She'd been so careful. 6 years of careful. 6 years of keeping her head down, her voice soft, her boys invisible. And then Emrys had spotted the wooden swords. She'd felt his hand slip from hers. She turned, and the space where he'd been standing was empty. Just a gap in the crowd where a 5-year-old boy had been and was no longer. Panic hit her like cold water, instant and total. Corvin, stay close. She gripped her other son's hand and pulled him tight against her hip. Corvin, the quieter one, the watcher, looked up at her with wide eyes and said nothing. He never needed to be told twice. Eloan scanned the market. Wooden stalls draped with canvas, smoke rising from a pig roasting over a fire pit, a blacksmith hammering somewhere, traders shouting prices over each other's heads. Too many bodies, too many faces. Emrys. She kept her voice low, controlled, even though every nerve in her body was screaming. She couldn't shout, couldn't draw attention. That was the first rule. The only rule that mattered. Don't be seen. Don't be remembered. She cut between two stalls, pulling Corvin behind her. Her eyes swept every gap, every cluster of children, every flash of dark hair. Nothing. Then she heard a sound that rearranged the architecture of her fear entirely. Drums. Deep and steady, rolling through the market, like approaching thunder. The crowd shifted, people craned their necks, murmuring, pressing toward the main road. Eloan watched in slow horror as a column of riders emerged from the tree line at the far end of the trading post. They rode in precise formation, silver-gray cloaks bearing a crest she knew better than her own hands, the Vaal crest. A wolf's head crowned in thorns, the blood drained from her face. So fast the world tilted, she pressed her back against the nearest stall, clutching Corvin against her. "No," she breathed. "No, no, no! He wasn't supposed to be here!" No royal party had visited these borderlands in a decade. Dunhalla was nothing, a smudge on a map. There was no reason for the Alpha King to ride through this village, no reason at all, unless the universe had decided to punish her for half a decade of believing she'd escaped. The riders entered the market square. Guards fanned out, and the crowd parted, people bowing and stepping back. And there at the center of the column, mounted on a black warhorse that made every other animal look like a pony, was a man Eloan had spent 6 years trying to forget. Soren Vail. Even from 50 feet away, even through the haze of smoke and dust and sheer terror, the sight of him knocked the breath from her lungs. He was broader than she remembered, harder. His jaw was sharper, his shoulders heavier with muscle, as if the years since she'd last seen him had been spent carrying something unbearable. The dark hair she used to twist around her fingers was cropped shorter now. His posture in the saddle was rigid and controlled, radiating the kind of authority that made grown men lower their eyes. Eloan's wolf stirred for the first time in years. A low whine, deep in her chest, instinctive and desperate, and she shoved it down with everything she had. She needed to find Emrys. She needed to find him and disappear before anyone in that column looked too closely at her or her sons. Because if Soren saw the boys, if anyone from the capital saw the boys, she moved. Corvin's hand locked in hers, weaving through the edge of the crowd, keeping stalls and carts between her and the royal procession. Her pulse hammered so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. Her eyes swept, left, right, left again. And then she found him. Emrys stood at the edge of the main road, 20 feet from the royal column. He'd been watching the riders with his mouth open, a half-eaten honey roll clutched in one sticky hand, completely mesmerized. A woman from a nearby stall must have given it to him. He was grinning, that wild, fearless grin that was going to get him killed one day. Eloan's stomach plummeted because Emrys wasn't just standing near the road. He was standing directly in the path of the Alpha King's dismounting guard, and one of the riders had already noticed him. She watched in frozen horror as the rider leaned down and said something to the boy. Demrys, who had never met a stranger he wouldn't talk to, looked up and replied with enthusiastic hand gestures. The rider frowned, tilted his head. Then he looked over his shoulder, toward the king, and called out something Eloan couldn't hear. Move. She needed to move. She needed to cross 20 feet of open ground, grab her son, and vanish. But her legs had turned to stone because Soren Viel was dismounting his horse. He swung down with the fluid ease of a man who'd spent his life in the saddle and turned toward whatever his guard had called about. His stride was unhurried. He hadn't seen the boy yet. He was looking at the guard, one eyebrow raised in mild irritation at being summoned for what was probably a curious child. Emrys turned to face him. Soren stopped walking. It was absolute. One stride he was moving. The next, he was rooted to the ground as if the earth had seized his boots. His entire body went rigid. His hand, which had been resting casually on his belt, dropped to his side and stayed there, fingers slightly open, like he'd forgotten he had hands. He was staring at the boy's face. At the small, round, dirt-smudged face, looking up at him with bright, curious, unmistakable eyes, silver gold, pale as winter light, wolf-bright, even in human form, veil eyes. Staring back at him from a child who couldn't be older than 5. Soren didn't speak, didn't move. The color bled from his face in a slow, terrible wave, and his expression, the one that never cracked, the one that commanded armies and silenced councils, came apart. Ho! Eloan watched the Alpha King of Ashenmoor look at her son, and she saw the exact moment recognition hit him. Not just recognition of the eyes. Recognition of something deeper, something coated in blood and bone and the primal instinct of a wolf. Encountering his own, Corvin's hand tightened. In hers, Eloan looked down. Her other son was staring at the king, too, his quiet face drawn, with an intensity no 5-year-old should possess. His silver gold eyes, identical to his brother's, identical to the king's, were wide and unblinking. "Mama," Corvin whispered, his voice barely audible, "that man smells like us." The air left Eloan's body. Across the square, Soren Viel's gaze lifted from Imris and swept the crowd with a predatory focus that turned her blood to ice. He was searching. He knew the boy wasn't alone. He knew there was a mother somewhere in this crowd, and he was going to find her. His eyes found hers. 6 years collapsed. Every mile she'd run, every night she'd spent terrified, every lie she'd told to keep her sons hidden, all of it disintegrated in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The king's expression shifted from shock to something far more dangerous, something raw and fractured and furious. Eloan couldn't breathe. 6 years earlier, Eloan had arrived at the Vale Palace with nothing. No family name, no bloodline, no wolf worth mentioning. A pale, undersized thing that other shifters barely registered. She'd been collected from the orphan house in Greymark at 14, assigned to the Palace Textile Hall at 15, and by 16 had become very good at being invisible. Invisible was safe. Invisible meant no one bothered you, no one expected anything, and no one noticed when you slipped extra bread from the kitchen into your apron pocket for later. She'd built a small, quiet life among the looms and thread spools of the lower palace, and she'd been content with it. Content was a generous word. Resigned was more honest. She was 19 the first time King Soren Vael spoke to her. Not to her, exactly. Near her. The distinction mattered, because kings did not speak to textile workers. They spoke to advisors, generals, dignitaries, and occasionally to the head of household staff, when the wine was wrong. They did not address Omega seamstresses, who smelled like cotton dust and candle wax. But the palace corridors were long and sometimes people took wrong turns. Even kings. She'd been carrying a bolt of indigo fabric to the upper gallery when she rounded a corner and walked directly into a wall that turned out to be a man. The fabric went everywhere. She went sideways, hit the stone floor on her hip, and found herself staring up at the most terrifyingly beautiful person she had ever seen. Soren Weil stood over her with an expression that suggested no one had physically collided with him in recent memory, possibly ever. His silver-gold eyes were startling up close, almost luminous, and they pinned her to the floor with the weight of absolute authority. "Are you injured?" he'd asked. Aloan had opened her mouth. Nothing came out. She tried again. A sound emerged, something between a squeak and a hiccup, which she would later replay in her mind with excruciating regularity for approximately the next 3 years. "I'll take that as a no," the king had said. And then impossibly the corner of his mouth had twitched. He'd reached down and pulled her to her feet with one hand. The contact lasted maybe 2 seconds, his fingers around her wrist, warm and impossibly strong, and in those 2 seconds, something shifted in the marrow of her bones. A click, a settling. Like a door she didn't know existed had opened somewhere deep inside her. She'd gathered her fabric with shaking hands, stammered something that might have been an apology, and fled. Her wrist burned for hours afterward. She told herself it was nothing, a chance encounter, a king being polite. Then it happened again, and again. Corridors where their paths shouldn't have crossed. A garden where she was mending tablecloths and he was walking alone at dusk. The kitchens at midnight, where she'd gone to sneak honey cakes, and found him already there, reading reports by candlelight, looking exhausted and strangely lonely. "You're the one who ran into me," he said that night, not looking up from his papers. "You were standing in the middle of a corridor, Your Majesty." Eloan had replied before her brain could stop her mouth. His eyes lifted. Something flickered in them. Surprise. Or maybe the memory of surprise. Like it had been so long since someone had spoken to him without deference that he'd forgotten the sensation. "So it was my fault," he said. "I wouldn't presume to assign fault to the king, and yet you just did." She should have apologized, should have bowed and retreated, and thanked every god that he seemed amused rather than offended. Instead, she'd sat down across from him, pushed the plate of honey cakes between them, and said, "These are better warm." By the way, he'd stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he'd taken a honey cake. That was how it started. Midnight conversations in the kitchen, accidental encounters that stopped being accidental, moments stolen from the margins of their impossibly different lives. She learned things about him that no one else knew. That he hated the formal banquets, but attended every one, because his father had told him a king who doesn't eat with his people is a king who's already lost them. That he read poetry when he couldn't sleep, old verses in a language she didn't recognize, and that the sound of his voice reciting them was low and rhythmic and achingly beautiful. That he carried the weight of every decision he made, like a physical thing, tallied and stacked on his shoulders, never set down, never shared. He learned things about her too. That she could identify any fabric by touch alone, blindfolded, that she hummed when she worked and didn't realize it. That she had never in her entire life had someone wait for her the way he waited for her in that kitchen, night after night, with a plate of honey cakes and the particular stillness of a man who had finally found the one place he didn't need to perform. He never touched her in public, never acknowledged her before the court. She was a ghost, in his world, existing only in the spaces between his duties, and she accepted that because she understood what she was. An omega with no name, no lineage, no standing, a girl who had been left on the steps of an orphanage with nothing but a wool blanket and a fading scent that no one ever came back to claim. Girls like her did not end up with kings. But Soren kept appearing. He kept finding her in empty hallways and quiet corners of the garden. And one night, 3 months after the first honey cake, he'd kissed her in the dark of the lower library with such desperate gentleness that her knees had given out entirely. "This is a terrible idea," she'd whispered against his mouth. I know, he'd replied and kissed her again. They never discussed what they were. He never called her his mate. The bond was there, unspoken, undeniable, a constant hum between them that made her skin tingle when he was close and ache when he was away. But naming it would make it real, and real things had consequences. Aloan was 20 when she realized she'd missed her cycle. She sat on the edge of her narrow cot in the textile hall dormitory, staring at her hands, and tried to breathe. Her wolf was purring a low, satisfied vibration she'd never felt before, and the terror was so absolute, it was almost peaceful, the way extreme cold eventually feels like warmth. She needed to tell him. Tomorrow night, in the kitchen, she would tell him everything, and they would figure it out together. She never got the chance. They came for her at dawn, 4 guards, armed, their faces blank. A woman walked behind them, tall and sharp-featured, dressed in court finery that caught the early light like a blade. Aloan recognized her immediately. Nerissa Blackmere, the High Counselor's daughter. The woman the entire court whispered would become Soren's queen. She was beautiful in the way that weapons are beautiful, elegant, precise, and designed to cause damage. Pack your things, Nerissa said from the doorway, her voice clipped and disinterested, as if she were dismissing a servant who'd spilled wine. You have 10 minutes. Eloan's hands clenched in her sheets. On whose authority? The king's, Nerissa replied, and something cold moved behind her eyes. Who else? A guard stepped forward and held out a rolled parchment. Eloan took it with numb fingers. The royal seal, the veil wolf, in dark wax, stared up at her from the bottom of the page, the words blurred, but she caught enough. Immediate removal, conduct unbecoming, banishment from Ashenmoor territories effective upon sunrise. The room swam. She pressed a hand to her stomach, an instinct she hadn't learned yet but already couldn't suppress. If you resist, Nerissa added calmly, the penalty is death. For Omegas who seduce above their station, the law is very specific. The word seduce landed like a slap. Aloan searched Nerissa's face for any sign of mercy, any crack in the porcelain composure, and found nothing. He ordered this? Aloan whispered. He signed it himself, Nerissa said. And Aloan's world ended quietly, without fanfare, in a dormitory that smelled like cotton dust. She walked out of the palace as the sun rose. No one stopped her. No one said goodbye. The gates closed behind her with a sound like a coffin lid settling into place, and Aloan walked into the wilderness beyond the walls with nothing but a cloth bag, 3 silver coins, and the knowledge that she was carrying the Alpha King's children. She didn't look back, not once. If she had, she might have seen a figure in the highest tower window, watching the road, waiting for someone who was already gone. The village of Brindlecross sat in a valley so deep the sun didn't reach the main road until mid-morning. It was the kind of place that existed on no official map, populated by people who preferred it that way, and surrounded by forests thick enough to swallow a person whole. Aloan had stumbled into it half-dead and fully pregnant, following a trader's trail that had thinned to a deer path and then to nothing. She'd been walking for 11 days. Her shoes had disintegrated somewhere around day 7. The silver coins were gone, traded for dried meat, and a ride on a cart that took her 60 miles south before the driver's route turned east. The woman who found her was named Thessa. Stout, gray-haired, sharp-tongued, and possessed of the kind of practical compassion that didn't waste time on sympathy when action was needed. She ran the village's herb shop, which was really a healer's practice that she refused to call a healer's practice because she said the word made people expect miracles. You look like something the forest chewed up and spat out, Thessa said, standing in her doorway, arms folded. That's not far from the truth. Eloan managed, before her legs gave out. Thessa caught her, hauled her inside, and didn't ask a single question until Eloan had been fed, bathed, and wrapped in a quilt that smelled like dried rosemary. When the questions did come, Eloin answered with the truth. Most of it. She'd been cast out of a noble household. She was pregnant. She had nowhere to go. The father? Thessa asked. Doesn't want me. Thessa looked at her for a long measuring moment, then nodded once. All right, you'll stay here. That was it. No interrogation, no conditions, no pity, just a spare room with a narrow bed and a window that overlooked Thessa's herb garden, and the quiet understanding that some stories were told in pieces, not all at once. The twins came early. A brutal, terrifying labor that lasted 14 hours and left Eloin shaking so hard Thessa had to hold her arms down to keep her from rolling off the bed. Amris arrived first, screaming before he was fully born, furious at the indignity of the whole experience. Corvin followed 4 minutes later, silent, his eyes already open and tracking the candlelight with unnatural focus. They were perfect, they were devastating, and they had their father's eyes. Eloin stared down at them, these two tiny squirming creatures with their silver gold irises catching the firelight, and felt her heart crack clean in half. One side flooded with love, so fierce it terrified her. The other side flooded with fear that would never fully drain. Well, Thessa said, peering at the babies with her arms crossed. Those are not common eyes. No, Eloin whispered. They're not. Anyone who sees those eyes will have questions. Yes, and you'd prefer they didn't. Eloin looked up at Thessa, and whatever the older woman saw in her face was enough. Thessa nodded and went to her shelves. She came back with a jar of dark paste, something between a dye and a tincture. Won't change the color permanently, she said. But if you darken their lashes and keep their heads down in bright light, it dulls the shine. Enough to pass as hazel if no one looks too long. It became ritual. Every morning, before the boys woke, Eloin applied the tincture to their lashes and brows with a fine-tipped brush. Every morning she turned extraordinary eyes into ordinary ones, and told herself she was keeping them safe. The boys grew fast, the way wolf-born children do. By 2, they were running. By 3, they were climbing trees, falling out of them, and climbing right back up with scraped knees and unshakable grins. By 4, their personalities had solidified into something Eloin could only describe as a divine test of her patience. Amris was fire. Bold, loud, reckless, and magnetically charming in a way that drew every living creature to him. He could talk a stray dog into following him home, convince the baker's daughter to give him extra rolls, and start a wrestling match with a boy twice his size and somehow win. He had his father's shoulders already, broad for his age, and his father's stubbornness, which arrived fully formed and showed no signs of softening. Corvin was smoke, quiet, watchful, eerily perceptive. He noticed things no 5-year-old should notice. The way a stranger's scent changed when they were lying, the shift in Thessa's posture when her joints ached before a storm, the precise moment his mother's smile stopped reaching her eyes. He rarely spoke first, but when he did, the words landed with a weight that silenced rooms. Eloin loved them with a ferocity that frightened her. Every bruised knee, every nightmare, every time one of them looked up at her with those unmistakable vile eyes and asked a question she couldn't answer, the love sharpened into something protective and lethal. She would burn the world down for them. She would burn quietly, invisibly, the way she did everything, but she would burn it down all the same. The fear was constant. It lived in her chest like a second heartbeat, steady and inescapable. Every traveler who passed through Brindlecross sent it spiking. Every unfamiliar scent on the wind made her pull the boys inside and close the shutters. She taught them early, instinct wrapped in games that didn't feel like lessons. Eyes down when strangers are near, a game. See who can stare at their shoes the longest. Don't tell anyone your mother's name, another game. Make up funny names instead. She was Gertrude 1 week, Barnacle the next. The boys thought it was hilarious. Eloin laughed with them and locked the terror behind her teeth. If anyone asks about your eyes, what do you say? We got them from our grandmother. Both boys would recite in unison. And where's your grandmother? Very far away, and she doesn't visit, Emrys would add with practiced solemnity, and then immediately ruin it by grinning. She told them nothing about their father. Emrys asked once, on a winter night when the fire was low and Corvin was already asleep, "Mama, why don't we have a papa?" The question hit her so hard, she had to turn away and grip the edge of the table. "Some families are shaped differently," she said, keeping her voice steady. "Ours is shaped like us." Emrys considered this for a moment, then nodded. "That's fine. You're better than a papa anyway." She'd held him until he fell asleep and then cried silently into his hair, but it was Corvin who worried her most. The quiet son, the one who watched and catalogued and never forgot. He'd started studying his own reflection in the water basin, with an intensity that made her skin prickle. One morning, she found him comparing his eyes to a drawing of a wolf in one of Thessa's old herbology books. "Mama?" he said, without looking up. "Why do the wolves in this book have eyes like mine?" Eloan's heart seized. Lots of things have golden eyes. Love, owls, cats. "These aren't golden," Corvin said, tracing the illustration with one finger. "They're silver gold, like mine, like Emrys's." He looked up at her, and the quiet knowing in his gaze made him look decades older than 5. "Like the Vale wolves." The room went very still. "Where did you learn that name?" Eloan asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thessa's books, the old ones on the top shelf." He paused. "She hides them." Eloan knelt in front of him and took his small hands in hers. "Corvin, listen to me carefully. You are never to say that name out loud again. Not to anyone. Not to Emrys. Not even to Thessa. Do you understand?" He studied her face with those ancient, patient eyes. "Is it dangerous?" "Yes. Are we dangerous?" The question pierced her. "No, sweetheart. You are the least dangerous thing in the world." The lie tasted like ash. Corvin nodded slowly, and she could see him filing this information away in whatever vast, meticulous archive lived behind his quiet expression. He wouldn't say the name again, but he wouldn't forget it either. It was Thessa who delivered the blow. She appeared in Eloan's doorway one evening, after the boys were asleep, with a crease between her brows and a folded parchment in her hand. "A courier came through today," she said, closing the door behind her. "From the capital, posted a decree in every village, between here and the Ashenmoor border." Eloan's blood chilled. "What kind of decree?" Thessa handed her the parchment. Eloan unfolded it with fingers that had gone cold and stiff. "A royal census of all wolf-born children. By order of the crown. Every settlement was required to register the name, age, and parentage of every shifter child under the age of 10. Inspectors would be dispatched to verify compliance. Non-compliance carried a penalty of imprisonment." Eloan read it twice. Her vision blurred on the third attempt. "When?" she managed. "Inspectors arrive within the fortnight," Thessa said quietly. "Why? Why now?" "He's never done anything like this before." Thessa was quiet for a moment. "There's a rumor from the capital. The king has no heir. The council is pressuring him, and the queen." She hesitated. "The queen is apparently unable to produce children." The queen. The word detonated silently inside Eloan's chest. He'd married. Of course he had. She'd been gone 6 years. What had she expected? "Eloan," Thessa said gently, "you need to leave Brindlecross before those inspectors arrive. If anyone sees the boy's eyes without the tincture, if anyone files a report—" "I know." Her voice came out flat and hollow. "The harvest market in Dunhallow is in 3 days. Take the boys. Buy travel supplies. There are settlements further south, past the Greymark border, outside of Ashenmoor jurisdiction, entirely. Run again." That was always the answer. Pack the boys, erase their tracks, and run further, faster, deeper into nowhere. Eloan looked toward the bedroom where her sons were sleeping, their small bodies tangled together the way they always slept, limbs overlapping, Emrys's arm thrown across Corvin's chest, and felt something crack inside her that she'd been holding together with nothing but willpower for 6 years. She folded the parchment and pressed it flat against the table. 3 days, she said. She didn't know that in 3 days, she'd be standing in a crowded market watching the Alpha King of Ashenmore stare at her son's face, like a man watching his own ghost. Eloan's body moved before her mind caught up. She lunged through the crowd, seized Emrys by the arm, and hauled him backwards so hard he yelped. Corvin was already pressed against her side, his small fingers gripping the fabric of her dress with white-knuckled intensity. "Mama! Oh!" "Quiet," she hissed, and the tone in her voice, a tone she had never used with her children, silenced Emrys instantly. She turned. The crowd had thickened around the royal procession, bodies pressing in on all sides. But there was a gap between 2 livestock pens to her left, and beyond that, the tree line. 60 feet of open ground, and then the forest. If she could get there, if she could just seal the market. Soren's voice carried across the square with the cold clarity of a man accustomed to being obeyed before the echo faded. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Guards moved immediately, positioning themselves at every exit, every gap between stalls, every narrow lane that led away from the square. Eloan stopped. The forest was still 60 feet away, but it might as well have been 60 miles. She felt him approaching before she saw him. The bond, dormant for years, buried under grief and distance and sheer force of will, surged to life with a violence that made her gasp. It roared through her chest like a river breaking a dam, pulling toward him with a desperation that bordered on physical pain. She fought it. She wrapped her arms around her son's and turned her back to him and fought it with everything she had. "Mama," Corvin whispered, his voice thin and trembling. "Mama, he's coming." Eloan closed her eyes. She could feel him behind her now, close enough that his scent reached her on the still air. Cedar and iron, and something darker beneath, something that smelled like sleepless nights and old grief. It hit her like a blow to the sternum. "Turn around." His voice was low, stripped of the commanding edge he'd used with the guards. This was something else entirely. Raw, fractured at the seams. Eloan didn't turn around. She couldn't. If she looked at him, every wall she'd spent years building would collapse, and she needed those walls. Her children needed those walls. "Please," he said, and the word came out like it had been dragged from somewhere deep and reluctant, like a man unaccustomed to asking for anything, let alone begging. She turned. Soren Vale stood 3 feet away, and up close the changes in him were devastating. He was harder, leaner, carved down to something essential and unforgiving. The boy she had loved in midnight kitchens was gone. In his place stood a king who looked like he hadn't slept properly in years, whose silver-gold eyes were burning with an emotion so layered she couldn't separate its component. Fury, grief, shock, hunger, and beneath all of it, something desperate. His gaze dropped to the boys pressed against her legs, and his face did something terrible. It simply broke. Not dramatically, not with sound or motion, but the way stone breaks along a fracture that's been waiting for years to give. A slow, silent splitting that changed the landscape of his entire expression. Emrys, who had never met a silence he didn't feel compelled to fill, looked up at the king and said, "Your horse is really big." Soren's mouth opened. Nothing came out. "Is it true you can turn into a wolf?" Amrys continued, completely undeterred by the fact that a king was falling apart 3 feet above him. "Because I heard wolves are huge, and you're already huge, so your wolf must be enormous." Corvin, still gripping his mother's dress, said nothing. He simply watched Soren with that quiet, measuring gaze that saw far too much. Soren lowered himself slowly until he was on one knee. The armor on his shoulders creaked. This close to the ground, he was eye level with both boys. And Eloan watched him search their faces with an intensity that made her chest ache. "What are your names?" he asked. And his voice had gone hoarse. "I'm Emrys. That's Corvin. He doesn't talk much, but he's smarter than everyone." Emrys leaned in conspiratorially. "Are you really a king?" Because I thought kings wore crowns. And you're just wearing normal clothes. Well, fancy normal clothes. Something crossed Soren's face, a spasm of emotion so raw that Aloan had to look away. He reached out, hesitated, then let his hand fall back to his knee. "How old are you?" he asked. "5," Emrys announced. "We'll be 6 in winter. Mama says she's going to make us a cake with honey in it." 5. Aloan watched the math land on Soren's face. Watched him count backward to the timeline to the last winter she'd spent in his palace, to the last time he'd touched her in the dark of the lower library. She watched the color drain from his face and then fled back in a rush of furious, agonized understanding. His gaze lifted to hers, and the question in it was so loud she could hear it without words. "Why didn't you tell me?" Aloan met his eyes and held them, her jaw tight, her arms locked around her son's. "You know why," she said quietly. Confusion flashed across his features, sharp and immediate. "No, I don't." A guard approached from behind and murmured something about the market, about the crowd growing restless. Soren didn't acknowledge him. His focus hadn't moved from Eloan's face. "Your Majesty," a new voice cut in. A tall man in a gray traveling cloak stepped forward and bent low beside the king. His face was angular, composed, and marked with the careful neutrality of someone trained to manage crises. Perhaps this conversation would be better suited to more private quarters. Soren's jaw worked. He looked at the man, back at Aloan, then at the two boys who were watching him with his own eyes. "Halden," he said, his voice controlled but barely. "Arrange a carriage, immediately." Halden, the king's beta, didn't blink. "For the woman and the children, sire? For all of us." The words landed on Aloan like a steel door swinging shut. She took an involuntary step backward, pulling the boys with her. "No," Soren's gaze snapped to her. "No, I'm not going anywhere with you." Her voice shook, but the defiance in it was real, forged in years of solitude and fear. "You don't get to seal a market and order me into a carriage like I'm cargo. I'm not your subject anymore. You made sure of that." Something shifted in his expression. Not anger, something worse. Bewilderment. "What are you talking about?" he asked. "You banished me." The words came out louder than she intended, sharp enough to turn heads in the nearby crowd. "You signed the order yourself. So don't stand there looking at me like you don't understand. Because you signed it, and I have spent 6 years." Her voice cracked, and she bit down hard on the inside of her cheek. She would not cry, not here, not in front of him. Not in front of her sons. Soren rose to his full height. He towered over her by nearly a foot, and the confusion on his face had calcified into something cold and focused. "I never signed any order," he said, each word carved from granite. "I have never banished anyone from this kingdom, and I have spent the last 6 years believing you left of your own accord." The ground shifted beneath Aloan's feet. Not physically, but something foundational, some load-bearing truth she'd built her entire life around, lurched sideways. "That's not true," she whispered. "Halden," Soren's voice cut the air. "The carriage, now." Halden moved. Guards moved. The crowd was being pushed back, a perimeter forming around them like the rings of a target. Emrys tugged on Eloan's hand. "Mama, are we going for a ride?" Aloan looked down at her son, at his bright, eager, completely oblivious face, and felt something inside her fracture. She looked at Corvin, who was watching her with eyes too old for his face, waiting to take his cue from her, trusting her to make the right choice. She looked at the king, at the man who had just told her that everything she believed for half a decade might be a lie. "If I go with you," she said slowly, "and this is a trap, I swear to every god who's listening, you will answer to me. Wolf or no wolf, king or no king." Something flickered across Soren's face. Not anger, not shock. Something startlingly close to admiration. "Noted," he said quietly. Loan climbed in with her sons, clutched against her sides, and her pulse roaring in her ears. The door closed behind them, and the horses began to move. Toward the capital, toward the palace she'd been thrown out of all those years ago, and toward a truth that was already unraveling faster than either of them could control. The palace at Ashenmoor was exactly as Elowen remembered, and completely unrecognizable. The stone walls were the same pale gray, the towers still rose like teeth against the skyline, and the veil banner still hung from the battlements in heavy folds of silver and black, but everything about how it felt had changed. Or maybe she had changed. The last time she'd passed through these gates, she'd been a terrified girl with nothing. Now, she was a terrified woman with 2 children, which was arguably worse, because now there were 3 hearts to protect instead of 1. The carriage had been silent for the 2-hour ride. Emrys had fallen asleep against her shoulder within the first 20 minutes, which was a mercy, because conscious Emrys would have peppered the king with questions until someone's head exploded. Corvin stayed awake the entire time, his pale wolf-bright eyes fixed on Soren with an unwavering focus that clearly unnerved the king, who spent most of the journey staring out the window with his jaw clenched so tight the muscle jumped beneath his skin. Twice, Soren had opened his mouth like he was going to say something. Twice, he'd closed it again. The third time, Corvin spoke first. "You look sad," the boy said. Soren blinked. His gaze dropped to Corvin, and Elowen watched him struggle with a simple observation, the way a drowning man struggles with a lifeline, wanting to grab it, afraid it would pull him under. "I'm not sad," Soren said. Corvin tilted his head. "Your sense says you are." The silence that followed was so dense, Elowen could feel it pressing against her eardrums. Soren stared at the 5-year-old boy who had just read him with the accuracy of a seasoned tracker, and something in his expression shifted from guarded to gutted. He didn't respond. Corvin didn't seem to need him to. The carriage pulled through the inner gates and stopped in a courtyard Elowen recognized as the private entrance, the one reserved for family and high-ranking officials, not the servants' gate she'd used for 5 years. The distinction was not lost on her. Halden was already waiting. Having ridden ahead, beside him stood a woman Elowen didn't recognize, an older attendant with a kind face and a no-nonsense posture. "Marin will see to the children's needs," Halden said as they climbed out. "Rooms have been prepared in the East Wing." "The East Wing," Elowen repeated flatly. The East Wing was where visiting nobles stayed. She'd only ever set foot in it to deliver mended curtains. "And what am I, a guest or a prisoner?" "You're under the king's protection," Halden said, his tone perfectly neutral. "That's not an answer." "It's the only one available at the moment." Emrys, now awake and vibrating with the energy of a child who'd spotted a castle, grabbed Corvin's arm. "Do you think they have swords? Like real ones? Do you think they'll let us hold one?" "No one is giving you a sword," Elowen said automatically. "I'd settle for a dagger," Emrys offered. No, Soren had been watching this exchange with an expression Elowen couldn't decipher. When Marin stepped forward to introduce herself to the boys, he turned to Elowen. "We need to talk," he said. Alone. She wanted to refuse. Every survival instinct she'd honed in exile screamed at her not to separate from her children, not to follow this man into any room where she couldn't see an exit. But the confusion she'd seen on his face at the market, the raw, stricken bewilderment when she'd accused him of banishing her, that was either the truth or the most convincing performance she'd ever witnessed. "1 hour," she said. "Then I go back to my sons." He nodded once and turned toward the interior corridors. Elowen looked at the boys. Emrys was already chattering at Marin about swords and horses, and whether the castle had a dungeon he could explore. Corvin caught her eye, and the look he gave her was so measured, so adult, it made her throat tighten. "We'll be fine, Mama," Corvin said. She kissed both their heads and followed the king into the palace. He led her to a study on the upper floor, a room she'd never entered before. Heavy shelves lined the walls, maps covered a central table, and the fire in the grate was burning low. Soren closed the door and stood with his back to it, blocking the exit. Though whether that was intentional or instinctive, she couldn't tell. "Tell me everything," he said from the beginning, so she did. The guards arriving at dawn. Nerissa standing in the doorway. The parchment with the royal seal. The words, "Conduct unbecoming. Banishment. The penalty for omegas who seduce above their station." She told it without emotion, laying out facts like stones on a table, because if she let herself feel any of it, she would shatter. Soren listened without moving. His face was unreadable, locked down tight, but his scent was not. It shifted as she spoke, cycling through disbelief, cold fury, and a grief so sharp it stung her nostrils. When she finished, the silence lasted a full minute. "Show me the parchment," he said. "I burned it." She'd thrown it into a campfire on the third night, watching the seal melt and curl. She'd needed it gone. Soren exhaled through his nose, a controlled breath that did nothing to conceal the rage building behind his ribs. "Describe the seal. Dark wax. The vile wolf. Thorn crown. Your signature beneath it." "What did the signature look like?" Aloan frowned. "Like a signature. Your name." "My name," he repeated. He crossed to the desk, pulled a blank sheet of parchment toward him, and signed it with a swift, practiced motion. He turned it to face her. Aloan stared at the signature. Soren Viel. The letters were sharp, angular, distinctly slanted to the left. Her memory of the banishment order flickered. The signature on that parchment had been rounder, hadn't it? More upright. She'd been so panicked, so devastated, she'd barely looked at it, before the meaning of the words had obliterated everything else. "That's not what was on the order," she said slowly, her voice barely audible. Soren's hand flattened against the desk. "No, it wouldn't have been, because I didn't write it." The room tilted. Eloan gripped the back of the nearest chair. "Then who?" "I have a suspicion," Soren said, and his voice had dropped to something low and lethal that made the hair on her arms rise. "But first, I need you to understand something." He stepped closer, not touching her, but close enough that his scent surrounded her completely. "I did not send you away. I would never have sent you away." She wanted to believe him. The bond was screaming at her to believe him, pulling toward him with a force that made her teeth ache. But years of survival had taught her that trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. "You didn't come looking for me," she said, and the accusation in it was quieter than she intended. Pain crossed his face, open and unguarded. "I did. For 2 years I searched. I sent scouts to every settlement between here and the southern border. I tracked your scent until it disappeared at the Greymark River." His hands clenched at his sides. "I was told you'd left willingly, that you'd been unhappy, that you'd found someone else." "Who told you that?" His jaw tightened. "Nerissa." The name landed between them like a blade driven into wood. "She told me you'd come to her before you left," Soren continued, each word pulled from him like a splinter. "That you'd confess the affair had been a mistake, that you wanted a fresh start, away from the palace, away from me." Aloan's nails dug into the chair's upholstery. "And you believed her?" "I didn't want to." His voice roughened. "But you were gone. No note. No word. Every trail went cold. And she was so convincing, so sympathetic." The last word came out, bitter enough to taste. "She comforted me, said she understood how painful it must be." Within a year, she'd positioned herself as the council's candidate for queen. The picture assembled itself in Aloan's mind with sickening clarity. Nerissa hadn't just removed a rival. She'd engineered a replacement. She'd cut Aloan from Soren's life with surgical precision, and then stepped neatly into the wound. "Is she here?" Aloan asked. "In this palace?" "She is the queen," Soren said, and the flatness of his tone told her everything about what that title meant to him. Nothing. It meant nothing. Halden's voice, low and measured. "Sire, the queen has been informed of your return, and is requesting an audience regarding your guests." Soren closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, the vulnerability was gone, replaced by the granite composure of a king preparing for battle. "Eloan," he said. Whatever happens next, do not leave the East Wing. Do not let the boys out of your sight. And do not, under any circumstances, be alone with Nerissa. The fear that shot through her was primal and immediate. Not for herself, for Emrys, for two small boys with their father's eyes sleeping in a palace where the woman who destroyed their mother's life was now wearing the crown. What is she going to do? Iloan whispered. Soren opened the door, and the light from the corridor fell across his face, illuminating the rigid set of his jaw and the cold fire in his eyes. Nothing, he said. I will make sure of that. He stepped through the door and was gone, leaving Eloin alone in his study, with her hands shaking and the taste of dread coating her tongue. Eloin didn't sleep that night. She sat in a chair between the two beds in the East Wing chamber, watching her sons breathe, and listened to the palace settle into darkness around her. The room was absurdly lavish compared to anything she'd known. Silk curtains, thick wool carpets, a fireplace large enough to stand in. Marin had brought supper on porcelain plates, roasted pheasant and soft bread and butter, molded into tiny flower shapes that Emrys had tried to eat all of before Eloin caught him. The luxury felt wrong, like wearing a dead woman's clothes. Emrys slept the way he did everything, with total commitment, sprawled across the mattress diagonally, with one leg hanging off the side and his mouth open. Corvin was curled into a tight ball near the headboard, his blankets pulled up to his chin. Though Eloin doubted he was truly asleep, Corvin had a way of lying very still and quiet, while his mind worked furiously behind his closed eyes. She was right. Around midnight, his voice drifted across the dark room. Mama. Yes, love. The man from the market. The king. A pause. He's our father, isn't he? Eloin's chest constricted. She'd been preparing for this question since the carriage ride, rehearsing answers in her head, trying to find words that were honest without being devastating. None of them were good enough. Yes, she said. The simplest truth. The hardest word. Corvin was quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was steady, but she could hear the fracture line running beneath it. Did he not want us? The question split her open. She crossed to his bed in 2 strides, gathered him against her chest, and held him so tightly he let out a small sound of protest. He didn't know about you, she murmured into his hair. He didn't know, but you thought he did. She pulled back to look at him. Those silver gold eyes, luminous even in the dark, were watching her with the terrible patience of a child who has figured out far more than any child should. I did, she admitted. I was wrong. Someone lied, Corvin said. It wasn't a question. Yes, someone lied. He absorbed this the way he absorbed everything, silently, completely, filing it away in the vast, meticulous archive of his mind. I don't like this place, he said finally. It smells like secrets. Eloin kissed his forehead. Go to sleep, Corvin. He didn't. Neither did she. Morning arrived, pale and thin through the silk curtains. A knock came with it, sharp and purposeful. Eloin opened the door to find Halden standing in the corridor, immaculately dressed and radiating the composed energy of a man who'd already been awake for hours. The king requests your presence at breakfast, he said. The boys are invited as well. Eloin hesitated. And the queen will not be in attendance, Halden replied, his tone carrying no inflection but conveying volumes. The breakfast room was small by palace standards, a private chamber with tall windows overlooking an interior garden. Soren was already there, seated at a round table that had been set for 5. He stood when they entered, and the movement had the stiffness of a man who hadn't slept either. His gaze went to the boys first. Eloin watched it happen, watched the way his eyes swept over them with a hunger he couldn't conceal, cataloging every detail, the shapes of their faces, the way they moved, the color of their hair, the eyes, always the eyes. Faye bounded into the room with the confidence of a child who assumed he was welcome everywhere. Is this your breakfast room? Do you eat here every day? Do you eat pheasant for breakfast too? Because we had pheasant last night, and it was excellent. I don't usually eat pheasant for breakfast, Soren said, and Aloan heard the faintest tremor beneath his composure. What do you eat? Porridge mostly. Emrys wrinkled his nose. You're a king, and you eat porridge. That seems wrong. Soren's mouth twitched. It does, doesn't it? Corvin entered quietly, positioning himself beside Aloan's chair with watchful precision. He studied Soren the way he studied everything, carefully, from a distance. And when their eyes met, something passed between them that Aloan felt through the bond like a plucked string. Recognition. Something deeper, cellular, encoded in the shared architecture of their wolves. Soren sat slowly, and Aloan noticed the way his hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white, as if the act of sitting calmly across from his own children required physical force. Breakfast was surreal. Emrys talked enough for 4 people. He asked about the castle's towers, the horses in the stables, the guards' swords, whether the king had ever fought a bear, and whether wolves could swim. Soren answered each question with careful, measured responses that gradually loosened as the meal went on, as if the sheer relentless warmth of Emrys's personality was melting something frozen inside him. When Emrys knocked over his cup of milk and it spread across the tablecloth in a white flood, he froze, eyes darting to Soren with the first flash of genuine fear Aloan had seen from him since they'd arrived. Soren looked at the milk, looked at Emrys, then he knocked over his own cup. Emrys stared. Soren's expression remained perfectly neutral. The milk pooled between them. Accidents happen, the king said. Emrys burst out laughing. A full-body, head-thrown-back laugh that filled the room like sunlight. And Aloan saw something break open across Soren's face that he couldn't hide fast enough. A crack in the armor. A flash of something so tender, it was almost unbearable to witness. Even Corvin's mouth curved slightly at the edges. After breakfast, Marin arrived to take the boys to the garden. Emrys went willingly, already talking about finding frogs. Corvin paused at the door and looked back at his mother, then at Soren. "Thank you for breakfast," he said. And the formality of it, a 5-year-old offering courtly manners with the gravity of a diplomat, made Soren's breath catch audibly. The door closed, silence settled. Aloan and Soren sat across from each other at a table stained with spilled milk, and the air between them was so charged it hummed. "They're extraordinary," Soren said, and his voice fractured on the last syllable. "I know. Emrys is exhausting. I was going to say fearless. That's the exhausting part." Soren's hands were flat on the table, pressed hard against the surface. "And Corvin, he stopped. His jaw worked. He sees everything, doesn't he?" "Everything," Aloan confirmed softly. When he opened them, they were bright with something he was fighting to contain. "I missed their entire lives." The words fell into the room like stones into deep water. Aloan felt the impact of them ripple through the bond, felt the magnitude of his grief. 5 years of first steps and first words and first scraped knees and midnight fevers and bedtime stories and birthday mornings. All of it taken from him, and he hadn't even known it was being stolen. "I wanted to tell you," she said, her throat tight. "Before, when I found out, I was going to tell you that night." "What night?" "The night before they took me. I was going to meet you in the kitchen. I had it planned." She pressed her fingers to her eyes. "I was going to put a honey cake between us and just say it." The reference landed. She watched memory move across his face like light through water. The kitchen, the midnight conversations. "The honey cakes. A honey cake," he repeated, barely audible. It seemed appropriate. A silence followed that was so full of everything unsaid, it seemed to have weight, seemed to press against the walls and windows of the room. "Tell me something," Soren said, his voice careful and raw. "Tell me something I missed." The request cracked her open in a way she hadn't expected. She looked at his hands on the table, at the tension in his wrists, at the way his fingers pressed white against the wood, and she understood that this wasn't curiosity. It was hunger. A starving man asking for anything, even crumbs. "Emrys spoke first," she said. "His first word was, 'No,' shouted it at Thessa when she tried to take a honey roll away from him. He wasn't even a year old. She paused, a trembling smile crossing her face. Corvin's first word was moon. He said it at the window one night, pointing up at the sky. So quiet, I almost missed it. Soren's throat worked. He didn't speak, but his eyes were bright, and she saw his hands curl into fists. Emrys walked at 10 months. Just stood up one day and marched across the room like he'd been doing it for years. Corvin took longer, 13 months, but when he finally walked, he did it perfectly. No wobbling, no falling. Like he'd been studying the mechanics and refused to attempt it until he could get it right. Soren made a sound, low and strangled, and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. They were born early, she continued, unable to stop now that the dam had broken. 14 hours of labor in a healer's cottage with no one but Thessa. I was terrified. But when they put Emrys in my arms, screaming his lungs out, and then Corvin, just watching me with those enormous eyes, I thought, we're going to be all right. The three of us. We're going to be all right. You shouldn't have had to do that alone, Soren said, his voice barely holding together. No, Eloin agreed quietly. I shouldn't have. Soren pushed back from the table and stood. He walked to the window and pressed his forehead against the glass, and Eloin could see the rigid line of his back, the controlled rise and fall of his breathing, the fists clenched at his sides. I am going to find out exactly what happened 6 years ago, he said, his voice low and precise, and edged with something lethal, and whoever is responsible is going to answer for every day I lost. The door opened without warning. Eloin turned. A woman stood in the doorway, tall and immaculate, dressed in deep emerald silk that caught the morning light. Her dark hair was swept into an elaborate arrangement that framed a face of sculpted porcelain beauty. Her expression was pleasant, her eyes were not. Darling, Nerissa said, her gaze moving from Soren to Eloin, with the fluid precision of a predator, assessing the distance between herself and Emil. I heard we have guests. How lovely. She smiled, and the warmth of it never reached anywhere close to her eyes. I simply had to come. Introduce myself. Nerissa moved into the room like smoke filling a jar, slow and deliberate and impossible to ignore. You must be the seamstress, she said, her gaze settling on Eloin with the precision of a pin through a butterfly. The little textile girl from the lower halls. I remember you vaguely. Eloin's spine went rigid. She could feel Soren behind her, feel the shift in his posture, the way his energy changed from grieving father to something guarded and predatory in the space of a single breath. Nerissa, he said, and his voice carried a warning that a smarter woman would have heeded. This isn't the time. Nonsense, darling. Nerissa crossed to the table with fluid grace and trailed her fingers along the back of a chair. Her gaze lingered on the 2 puddles of spilled milk, soaking into the linen, and something cold flickered across her expression before the pleasant mask slid back into place. You've brought a woman and 2 children into our home. The least I can do is welcome them properly. Our home. The possessive landed precisely where it was aimed. Eloin felt it hit her sternum like a dart. Nerissa turned to face her fully, and up close, the woman was even more striking. High cheekbones, dark eyes, framed by lashes that cast shadows, a mouth curved into a smile that performed warmth without generating any. She smelled like jasmine and something metallic, beneath it that Eloin's wolf identified immediately as threat. The children are charming, Nerissa continued. Such unusual eyes. I noticed them in the courtyard this morning. She paused, letting the observation breathe. People will talk, of course. You know how courts are. Rumors spread faster than fever. There won't be rumors, Soren said flatly. There are already rumors, my love. Nerissa's smile didn't waver. A mysterious Omega arrives with twin boys who bear a striking resemblance to the king. The court has been whispering since dawn. Some are calling them illegitimate. Others are using less generous terms. The word illegitimate detonated inside Eloin's chest. She felt it blow through every wall she'd built. every carefully constructed layer of composure, and what remained was something raw and bright and furious. "They are not illegitimate," Elowen said, and her voice came out steady as iron. "They are his sons." The room went very still. Nerissa's smile thinned by a fraction, just enough to reveal the edge beneath. "Perhaps," Nerissa said. "But legitimacy isn't about blood, is it? It's about law, about recognition, about timing." She turned to Soren. "The council will have questions, darling. They'll want proof of lineage, formal acknowledgement, and of course, the matter of succession becomes rather complicated when an unclaimed Omega appears with children after years of silence." Soren's expression had turned to stone. "We will discuss this later, will we?" Nerissa's gaze swept back to Elowen, and something in it sharpened. A warning disguised as curiosity. "I do hope you'll be comfortable during your stay, however long it lasts." She left the way she'd arrived, smooth and unhurried, leaving Jasmine and menace hanging in the air behind her. The moment the door closed, Elowen's composure cracked. Her hands started shaking. Not with fear, with rage so pure it felt like a physical substance flooding her veins. "She did it," Elowen said. "She's the one who forged the order. She looked me in the face 6 years ago and told me you wanted me gone. And she's standing in this room wearing a crown she stole." Soren's fist hit the table with enough force to split the wood. The crack echoed through the room like a gunshot. Elowen flinched, but she didn't step back. "I know," he said, breathing hard through his nose. "I know. But proving it is different from knowing it. She's spent years building alliances on the council. Half my advisors owe their positions to her family. If I move against her without irrefutable proof, she'll turn the court against you." "She'll turn the court against the boys," Soren corrected, and the distinction hit Elowen like a blade. "She won't come for me. She'll come for them. She'll petition for a formal inquiry into their legitimacy, demand verification of the bond, argue that unregistered wolf-born children of uncertain parentage pose a security concern. She will use the law like a weapon, and she will aim it directly at Emrys and Corvin." Elowen's blood turned to ice. "Then I'll take them," she said. "Tonight, we'll disappear. I've done it before. And go where?" Soren turned to face her, and the anguish in his expression was devastating. "She knows about them now. She'll have scouts on every road. Within the hour, running won't protect them anymore. Staying might kill them. Staying is the only way I can shield them." His voice dropped. "I can protect them here, within these walls, under my authority. But only if you trust me enough to stay. Trust." The word landed between them with the weight of everything that had been broken. Elowen stared at him, at this man she'd loved in secret, who she'd believed had thrown her away, who she now understood had been searching for her while she ran, who had married the woman responsible for all of it, because he'd been fed lies so convincing even his wolf hadn't detected them. 6 years of trust destroyed. Now he was asking her to rebuild it overnight. "I don't know how to trust you," she said. "Honestly, I've spent 6 years learning." Not to. Pain moved across his face like a shadow. She wrapped her arms around herself. "But I trust that you love them. I saw it at breakfast. The way you looked at Emrys when he laughed. The way you couldn't breathe when Corvin spoke to you." Her voice thickened. "You love them. That's enough. For now, that's enough." Something in Soren's expression shifted, and for a moment, the king disappeared entirely, and she saw the man. Just the man. Tired and wounded and grateful in a way that words couldn't carry. "I'll need the proof by week's end," he said, pulling himself back into composure. "Halden is already searching the archives for the original banishment order. If Nerissa forged it using a palace seal, there will be a record." Elowen nodded. 1 week. She could survive 1 week. She was wrong about that. It took 3 days for Nerissa to make her move. The boys had been in the garden with Marin, chasing butterflies. Or, rather, Emrys was chasing butterflies while Corvin sat beneath an oak tree identifying species from a book he'd found in the palace library. A normal afternoon, safe. watched. Elowen had been in the east wing, sorting through clothing Marin had brought for the boys, when the door opened and Corvin walked in alone. His face was white, his hands were shaking. "Where's your brother?" Elowen asked immediately. "A woman took him." Corvin's voice was small but precise. "She said she was taking him to see the horses." Marin tried to stop her, but the woman had guards. Elowen's world went white at the edges. "What woman?" Corvin looked at her, and the controlled terror in his ancient eyes made her want to scream. "The one who smells like flowers and metal." Elowen was running before he finished the sentence. Through corridors she didn't know, past servants who pressed against walls to let her pass, following a scent trail of jasmine and her son's fear that cut through the palace air like a bleeding wound. She burst into the throne room, a vast, vaulted chamber she'd never set foot in, and found Nerissa seated on the dais with Emrys standing beside her. The boy wasn't hurt. He was standing very still, his face pale, his bright confidence dimmed to something small and confused. Nerissa's hand rested on his shoulder with the casual possessiveness of someone holding a piece on a game board. Half the council was assembled. They sat in tiered seats flanking the dais, and their faces showed a spectrum from discomfort to calculating interest. This had been arranged, orchestrated. "Ah!" Nerissa said pleasantly. "There she is." "Take your hand off, my son." Elowen's voice was a snarl, low and vibrating with a fury that made several council members shift in their seats. "Your son," Nerissa's eyebrows rose. "That's precisely the matter under discussion. I've convened an emergency session to address the question of these children's parentage and their legal standing within the kingdom." Elowen's gaze swept the room. Soren wasn't there, neither was Halden. She was alone. "The law is clear," Nerissa continued, addressing the council with practiced authority. "Unregistered wolf-born children discovered within Ashenmoor's borders must be formally identified and claimed within 7 days, or be remanded to the Crown's custody as wards of the state. Given that these children have lived unregistered for 5 years, and given that no formal claim of paternity has been filed." "Enough!" The voice came from the back of the chamber, and it carried the weight of absolute command. Every head turned. Soren stood in the doorway, Halden beside him. In the beta's hand was a leather folio, aged and creased, and the sight of it drained the color from Nerissa's face. Soren walked forward. The crowd parted. His gaze was fixed on Nerissa with an intensity that made the air in the room feel thin. "Remove your hand from my son," he said, "or I will remove it for you." Nerissa's composure held, but her hand lifted from Emrys's shoulder. The boy bolted, running across the throne room and crashing into Elowen's legs so hard she stumbled. She caught him, lifted him, pressed his face against her neck, and held on. "Halden," Soren said, without looking away from Nerissa. "Read it." The beta opened the folio and read the recovered banishment order aloud to the silent chamber. The forged seal, the fabricated charges, the signature that didn't match the king's hand. And beneath it, buried in the palace archives for 6 years, the original requisition for the seal press, signed by Nerissa Blackmere, 3 days before Elowen's removal. The chamber erupted. The aftermath was not clean. It was not swift. And it did not feel like victory. Nerissa was escorted from the throne room by 6 guards, while the council dissolved into chaos behind her. She didn't scream or protest or beg. She walked out with her chin raised and her eyes fixed straight ahead, and the only sign that anything had changed was the slight tremor in her hands, quickly hidden in the folds of her skirt. Elowen watched her go, Emrys still clinging to her neck, and felt nothing, not relief, not satisfaction, not the vindication she'd imagined in years of dark, bitter fantasies, just a hollow, ringing emptiness where the anger had been. Soren handled the council with the ruthless efficiency of a man who had been planning his next 3 moves while everyone else was still processing the first. He issued a formal declaration of paternity. He ordered the fraudulent banishment order struck from the record. He appointed a tribunal to investigate Nerissa's co-conspirators. And he did all of it without raising his voice, without breaking composure, without looking at Elowen once. She understood. In that room, surrounded by the political machinery of his kingdom, he couldn't afford to be a man with a breaking heart. He had to be the king, but she saw his hands trembling when he signed the paternity declaration. Halden found her in the East Wing an hour later, sitting on the floor between the boys' beds, while Emrys slept with his thumb in his mouth, a habit he'd abandoned 2 years ago and apparently reclaimed under stress. And Corvin read silently beside her, his shoulder pressed against hers. "The Queen has been confined to her chambers pending formal proceedings," Halden said from the doorway. Aloan nodded. The word queen scraped against something raw inside her. "She won't be queen much longer," Halden added quietly. "The marriage was built on fraud. The council is already discussing annulment." Aloan looked at him. "And Soren? He's in his study. He's been there since the council adjourned." Halden paused, choosing his next words with care. "He's asked to see you when you're ready. No pressure, no summons. A request." Corvin looked up from his book. "Go, Mama." She found Soren exactly where Halden said he'd be. The study was darker now. The fire burned down to embers. The maps and documents from their earlier conversation still spread across the table. He was standing by the window, his forehead pressed against the glass, exactly as he'd stood that morning. But everything was different now. He heard her enter, but didn't turn. She closed the door behind her and stood in the dim, warm space between the bookshelves and the dying fire, and waited. "When you left," he said finally, his voice rough and low, "I searched for you. You know that already. But what I didn't tell you is why I stopped." He pressed his palm flat against the glass. "And then I stopped." "Nerissa told you I'd left willingly," Aloan said. "Yes, but that's not why I stopped." He turned, and his face was stripped bare. No composure, no authority, no crown. Just a man standing in a dark room with 6 years of grief carved into the hollows beneath his eyes. "I stopped because I believed I wasn't enough. That you'd seen who I really was, what this life really was, and decided you deserved better." The words hit her so hard she had to brace against the bookshelf. "I told myself the same thing," she whispered, "for 6 years. That I wasn't enough. That you saw what I was, a nameless omega with nothing to offer, and decided I wasn't worth keeping." They stared at each other across the room, and the symmetry of their wounds was so perfect it was almost cruel. Two people who had loved each other in the dark, separated by a lie that had exploited the exact same fear in both of them. "You're not enough. You never were." Nerissa hadn't needed magic or violence. She just needed to know where they were already broken. "I should have kept searching," Soren said. "I should have torn this kingdom apart until I found you. I should have—" "Stop." Aloan crossed the room. She stood in front of him, close enough to touch, and looked up into those silver-gold eyes that her sons had inherited like a brand. "You believed a lie. So did I. We both spent 6 years punishing ourselves for something that wasn't our fault." His hand came up slowly, trembling, and cupped her face. The contact sent a jolt through the bond so powerful her vision blurred. She felt everything: his grief, his fury, his guilt, his desperate, aching love, all of it pouring through the connection, like water through a broken wall. "I'm not going to punish you for the years we lost," she said, pressing her cheek into his palm. "And you don't get to punish yourself either. We're done with that, Aloan." Her name in his mouth was a prayer and an apology and a homecoming all at once. "I spent 6 years being invisible," she said, her voice thick with tears. She'd stopped fighting, hiding, shrinking, teaching my sons to keep their heads down and their eyes averted, because who they are was dangerous. "I am so tired of being small." His other hand came up, cradling her face, tilting it toward him. "You walked into a king's kitchen and told him his honey cakes were better warm. You raised 2 extraordinary boys alone in a village that didn't exist on any map. You threatened to hold a king accountable in front of his entire guard." A choked laugh escaped her, wet and raw. That wasn't courage, that was terror. It was both. His thumb brushed the tears from her cheek. And it was magnificent. She kissed him. She rose on her toes and pressed her mouth to his, and the bond detonated. It was nothing like the gentle, secret kisses they'd shared years ago in dark corridors and empty libraries. This was an explosion, 6 years of separation and grief and longing collapsing into a single point of contact. His arms wrapped around her and pulled her against his chest with a force that lifted her off the ground. She could feel his heartbeat hammering against her ribs, could feel the bond surging between them, demanding completion, demanding permanence. He pulled back, barely, his forehead pressed against hers, his breathing ragged. "Are you sure?" "I've been sure since the first honey cake," she whispered. He kissed her again, deeper, and she felt the bond settle into place, not with the sharp snap of a lock, but with the slow, warm certainty of something that had always been there, finally acknowledged, finally allowed. The mating bite was instinctive, his teeth against the curve of her neck, gentle and then firm, and the bond flared golden and complete in her chest, warm and steady and permanent as a heartbeat. She bit him back, marking him as hers, and felt his sharp intake of breath shudder through them both. They held each other in the dark study, foreheads touching, breathing together, the fire dying around them, and neither of them caring. "The boys," Aloan said eventually, her voice muffled against his chest, "you need to know something about them. Emrys will talk your ear off and demand a sword by tomorrow morning. Corvin will say nothing for 3 days, and then deliver a single sentence that makes you question your entire life." Soren's chest shook with quiet laughter. "I noticed. Corvin knew who you were before anyone told him. He found your family name in Thessa's books. He's been carrying that secret for months." Soren was quiet for a long moment. "He's 5. He's your son," Aloan said. "And he's terrifyingly perceptive. And he needs a father who sees him, not just the quiet one, not just the easy one, but really sees him. And Emrys? Emrys needs a father who can keep up with him." She smiled against his chest. "Good luck." He tightened his arms around her. "I want to do this right. I know I've already missed more than I can ever recover, but whatever comes next, whatever time we have, I want to be there for every part of it." "Then be there," she said simply. "That's all they need. That's all any of us need." Silence settled around them, warm and unhurried. Through the window, the first pale light of dawn was touching the horizon, turning the sky from black to deep violet. "Soren?" "Yes?" "I'm going to need a bigger room, and proper pillows. The ones in the East Wing are stuffed with what I can only assume is compressed regret." He laughed, a real laugh, full and warm and completely unguarded, and the sound of it filled the study like morning light filling a room that had been dark for far too long. The court adapted, as courts do, slowly, grudgingly, and with a great deal of gossip. A foundling Omega, as the Alpha King's mate, was not what anyone had anticipated. The whispers followed Aloan through every corridor, every formal dinner, every public appearance. She heard them in the rustle of silk behind her back, in the carefully neutral expressions of council members who smiled to her face and raised their eyebrows the moment she turned away. "She won't last a season," they said. "She has no breeding, no training, no understanding of politics. The boys are wild, the quiet one is strange, the king has lost his mind." Aloan let them whisper. She had survived 6 years of exile, 2 days of labor alone in a healer's cottage, a midnight confrontation with a queen who wanted her children erased from existence, and the daily chaos of raising Emrys. Court gossip barely registered. Nerissa's trial was brief and devastating. The evidence was irrefutable. The forged seal, the falsified order, the letters recovered from her private chambers detailing the entire conspiracy in her own hand. She was stripped of her title, her lands, and her freedom. The annulment was granted unanimously. Aloan didn't attend the sentencing. She sent Nerissa no message, spared her no final words. Some doors, once closed, deserved to stay closed. The boys settled into palace life, with the adaptability that only children possess. Amorous befriended every guard, every stable hand, every kitchen worker within his first week, and had somehow convinced the master-at-arms to begin sword lessons 3 months ahead of the approved age. Sorin pretended to disapprove. Aloan caught him watching from the upper balcony, every single session, his expression soft with a pride so fierce it bordered on pain. Corvin found the library, and rarely left it. He read voraciously, indiscriminately, consuming histories, herbologies, bestiaries, and military strategy with equal appetite. He spoke more now, though still less than his brother, and when he did, people listened with the startled attention of those who have realized that the quiet child in the corner understands more than everyone else in the room, combined. Soren learned to be a father, the way he did everything, with intense focus, occasional miscalculation, and a stubborn refusal to fail. He read to the boys at night, stumbling through adventure tales in a voice too deep and too serious for children's stories, while Emerus corrected his character voices, and Corvin dozed against his shoulder. He still woke sometimes, in the dark, reaching for Elowen in a panic, as if some part of him would never fully believe she was real, that she was there, that she wasn't going to vanish again. "I'm here," she would murmur, finding his hand in the dark. "I'm not going anywhere." One morning, weeks after the trial, Aloan woke to pale sunlight and an empty bed. She found Soren in the garden, sitting on a stone bench beneath the oak tree that Corvin had claimed as his reading spot. Both boys were with him. Emrys was demonstrating a sword stance he'd learned, his wooden blade cutting the air with enthusiastic imprecision. Corvin sat beside Soren on the bench, reading, his small shoulder pressed against his father's arm. Soren looked up and saw her watching from the doorway. He smiled, and the expression transformed his entire face, stripped away the king, the commander, the man who carried a kingdom's weight on his shoulders, and left behind someone who was simply, entirely, profoundly happy. Emrys spotted her and lowered his sword. "Mama, watch! Papa taught me a new move." "Papa?" The word hit Elowen in the chest with the force of a revelation. She pressed her hand to her mouth, tears blurring her vision, and watched her son swing his wooden sword with joyful, clumsy abandon, while the Alpha King of Ashenmoor sat on a garden bench and applauded every single attempt. Corvin looked up from his book, caught her eye, and smiled. A real smile, rare and precious, that said, without words, what he would never waste words saying: "We're home." Aloan crossed the garden, sat beside Soren, and leaned her head against his shoulder. His arm came around her immediately, pulling her close, and the bond hummed between them, warm and golden and settled. Not perfect, never perfect, but whole.